cost of dysgenics crisis. It's that we have more and more people who essentially suffer from mental weakness and are not able to cope with unpleasant things happening to them, which involve them having to struggle and involve them having to actually make decisions and involve them actually having to fight for their own interests. But before we look now, we know that in terms of intelligence, we know for various reasons I've looked at in other programs, contraception, people who have high IQ are better able to use contraception, people who have low IQ are less efficient users of contraception, they're too impulsive to use it, and so therefore they have more children, and there's a minus 0.2 correlation between intelligence and fertility. We know that in the UK, if you divide up the country between those that have where both parents are working, average IQ 100, those where one parent's on welfare, average IQ 90, those where two parents are on welfare, average IQ sort of 85, and those where both parents are on welfare and there's criminals involved from the police and social workers, basically the criminal underclass. It is what people in my grandparents' generation would have called the rough. It is only those people who have above replacement fertility. So it is those people that multiply. It is people of low IQ who multiply, and we are losing on that basis because of contraception. That's one reason, but there's other reasons as well. The women who have high IQ will tend to dedicate all of their 20s and even the first half of their 30s to their careers and only have one or two children. People who have low IQ will be pregnant at 16. They'll have loads of kids by multiple men. Then they'll be grandparents by the time they're 40, and therefore they have not just more children but more generations. There's all kinds of factors that are behind this, but what it means is that we are losing possibly as much as at least 1 IQ point per decade, and possibly as much as 2.4 IQ points per decade. And we know that we've lost something like, based on reaction times are getting longer, we've lost something like 15 IQ points, which is the difference between, let's say, the average person and a science teacher, or a science teacher and a science professor, or a low-level security guard and the average person, policeman, fireman, office worker, or whatever, between 1880 and 2000, and we would have lost another couple of points since then. So this is a very, very significant change in the average IQ. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means that you have more and more people in the society who cannot solve problems, who live in the now, who don't think about the future. I mean, you could, in my book, At Our Wits' End, there is a list of the correlates of low IQ, who do not think about the future, who are selfish and only think of themselves, who age quickly, are prone to alcoholism and addiction, are highly conservative, so therefore they won't move about or change or move to a different town in pursuit of a job. Now, in the 1930s, when there was an economic crisis, you'd have people moving from Wales to Winchester just looking for work. There's nothing like that now. They just stay where they're from and are unemployed rather than make serious moves in pursuit of work. They're higher in delinquency. They're higher in illegitimacy. They're higher in impulsivity. They're higher in obesity. They're higher in sort of self-esteem. They're and all of the things that are positive, even things like memory or reasoning skills. They are, or practical knowledge or social skill or whatever, they are lower in. And so the result of that is they're simply less able to cope. They're certainly not going to save money for the future, and they are less able to psychologically cope when things go wrong. The second thing is that low intelligence is part of a suite of traits which is known as a fast life history strategy. We've looked at this on the channel before. So a fast life history strategy is that you're born in an easy yet unstable environment, but an easy environment. And in an easy environment, you live fast and die young. In an easy environment, the food is all around you. It's growing on the trees. There's therefore no need to develop very high IQ. There's no need to develop pro-social traits such as conscientiousness and impulse control, because they won't be rewarded. You don't have to think of the future. If anything, you must be impulsive because there are immediate dangers. There's no need to select for agreeableness and cooperation, because these things, well, if you act kindly to somebody, it might not be reciprocated. So it's a waste of your energy, your bioenergetic resources. So you don't learn to be agreeable. You don't have anything to be disagreeable and selfish. And mental instability, that is to say, feeling negative feelings strongly, that's selected in favour of, in the sense that if you feel anger strongly, you can destroy whatever sudden evil, horrible thing might come and attack you. And there's no selection against it. There's no selection against things like anxiety or depression or whatever. You are selected to an environment of ease. That is your evolutionary match. Now, Now, the other extreme is a K strategy. The species reaches the carrying capacity for the ecology. Members start to compete with each other. How do they compete with each other? They compete with each other by being more intelligent. They compete with each other by being more conscientiousness and planful of the future and so forth. They compete with each other by being more agreeable and cooperating and turning into a highly cooperative groups. So life sort of slows down, and they invest energy away from sex and towards nurture, and to ensure that their offspring survive. How do you get better at nurturing? Higher agreeableness, higher conscientiousness, and lower mental instability. So you're a more stable person, you're less likely to become depressed, you're less likely to become anxious, you're more able to cope with adversity, because what you're living in a slow life history strategy ecology is an environment which is stable yet harsh. So stability, that militates in favour of intelligence and conscientiousness and whatever, and the harshness, that militates in favour of coping, of mental stability, of mental strength, and therefore of not getting things like depression or anxiety, because you have to be able to cope with hard things happening to you. So what it predicts low socioeconomic status is not just low IQ, but it's also, I mean, what predicts high socioeconomic status is high IQ plus what's called general factor of personality. And what that is that you are high in agreeableness, so therefore you learn from people and you cooperate with people and you move up the social hierarchy. You are high in conscientiousness, and therefore you follow the rules, and you're hardworking, you're diligent, and therefore you move up the social hierarchy. And that you're low in most aspects of neuroticism, so you're not a temperamental person, you're not an angry person, you don't get depressed, you don't get anxious, you cope with life, you find coping strategies to deal with it and whatever. The only element of neuroticism which seems to be positively associated with socioeconomic status is social anxiety, because this causes you to get on with people, which is important to socioeconomic status, and some moderate level of anxiety which motivates you to work hard and worry about the future. But that's basically the difference. So what you have with working class people is what we have then is basically what we were selected for under harsh Darwinian conditions was high intelligence. We know we were selecting for that across time. But also with general factor of personality, being pro-social. We were selecting for that across time. Now, with the collapse of these harsh Darwinian conditions because of the Industrial Revolution in 1800 or whatever, what you have is a tremendous weakening of Darwinian pressures. The child mortality was 50% in 1800, and it was 1% by now. So a huge collapse in child mortality. Now, what child mortality was doing was essentially killing to put it doesn't sound very nice to say it like this, but it was killing the lower classes, because child mortality was much higher among those of low socioeconomic status than high. They were being killed off every generation. Indeed, it was found that, according to wills and so forth, that the completed fertility of the richer 50% of the population in about 1600 was double that of the poorer 50% of the population. So what you had was a society of social descent. It was bootstrapping the population. Every generation, those at the bottom would die out, and those the next layer up would move down to fill the places, and those at the top would become more intelligent and more pro-social. And then overall, over a long period of time, society becomes more intelligent and more pro-social. So, and then you get the Industrial Revolution and so forth, which means that you have better medicine, better conditions, whatever, and so you have a collapse in child mortality. And what that heavily influenced was the completed fertility of the working classes, which of course went up. It was them who had very high child mortality, and their completed fertility goes up. So there's more and more and more and more of them, more and more people like that. And we stop being a society of social descent. And at the same time that's happening, the people at the top, who are high intelligence and high GFP, they're not passing on their genes, so they're kind of boiling off. So society is becoming less intelligent, and it is becoming less pro-social, and it's been demonstrated, that you can see it in my book, for genetic reasons. So what you're going to get then is more and more and more people at the lower end of society who, under harsh Darwinian selection pressures, or even under not even that harsh Darwinian selection pressures, and let's say in 1900 when child mortality was 10%, those people would have died as children. Because having a high mutational load, it's a general factor. We can call it a fitness factor. Things that are genetically selected for, they end up correlating together. So intelligence would have correlated with pro-social personality and all this sort of thing, and they into the K factor, and they would have been selected for. The opposite, low intelligence and R strategy, they would have been selected against. What you would get, therefore, with the collapse of Darwinian selection pressures would be a rise in low intelligence, are strategists who are evolved to an environment of ease, involved to an environment where the food is just on the trees, involved to an environment of just live fast and die young. Now you're going to get more and more and more people like that, and those people are going to be in the most pronounced form right at the bottom of society, and those people are going to be also high in physical illness, which I'll look at in a minute. They all intercorrelate because it's a general factor of mutation. All these things, mental illness, physical illness, low IQ, they all genetically intercorrelate. It's called pleiotropy. So the things that are positive genetically intercorrelate, and the things that are negative genetically intercorrelate. And so these people are not just low in IQ, but they are low in they are highly in psychopathic traits, they're high in those, and they are high in mental illness. Now, what the result of that is that they simply cannot cope with this situation. They are in an evolutionary mismatch. What they are evolved to is the artificial jungle, or very stable jungle, so zoo. The artificial zoo, which is created by high civilization, in which there is an abundance of food and it's just there on the trees, and you don't have to compete for it, you don't have to cope, you don't have to fight, you don't have to compete for resources. There just are resources, and that's what they're evolved to deal with. If you put them in a situation where they must compete for resources, where there aren't enough resources, where they have to fight to survive, then they can't cope with that, and they will become, and what if you're put in an evolutionary mismatch, then you tend to become maladaptive, and you make maladaptive choices. So they become depressed, and they become anxious, and then you have suicidal ideation, and such people would it kind of sends them mad, and they would rather kill themselves than do the things which are necessary in order to cope with their current reduced circumstances, because they are not evolved to deal with it. They're not evolved to deal with adversity. They have mental weakness. They're not evolved to cope with serious stresses. And so, because they have manifested in an ecology where there are no serious stresses. If you go back 100 years, such people would have been born who are prone to things like depression and anxiety and whatever. They have high general mutational load, so they would also have weak immune. They would have weak immune systems. Remember, the brain is 84% of the genome, so if you've got maladaptations of the brain, i.e., depression, anxiety, that sort of thing, you're sure as damn it going to have them of the body, and so therefore such people would have had weak immune systems, and they would have died as children of measles or scarlet fever or something like that. But they haven't died because of our innovations of Industrial Revolution. They haven't done that. They've lived, they've passed on their genes, and they now find themselves in a situation where life is difficult, and they're not adapted to cope with that, and so therefore they become suicidal and mentally ill. So you've got to understand that a lot of these people that are the cost of living crisis would never have existed 100 years ago. They'd be dead. They'd have died as babies. Maybe their parents would never have existed either, but certainly they wouldn't. They'd have been dead. So that's what we're seeing. We're seeing people who are not adapted to an environment of difficulty, who would be dead under any kind of environment of difficulty, suddenly having to cope with it. What's the result? They become suicidal, they become mentally ill, they can't cope. In addition, there is an environmental component to this. So life has traditionally been harsh, and we have traditionally been brought up to be put on the adaptive roadmap of life, where we have been prepared for a harsh yet stable ecology via a harsh yet stable childhood, in which lots of unpleasant things are allowed to happen to us, such that we can cope with the adversities of life and the adversities of adulthood. Even little things like losing at sports races in schools, which as a person that was born 3 months early, I always did and was always last, or being bullied at school, or being left out, or not being able to afford something, or whatever it happens to be, and this allowed you, or perhaps even corporal punishment at school, and this prepared people to cope with the adversities of life because they came up with strategies of dealing with it. And also such people, if we go back a few generations, they would have known serious stressors such as being hungry, such as not having enough food, such as some degree of mortality, salients, perhaps, such as losing a parent when they were young, or losing a brother or a sister. They would have known serious stresses like this, and they would have been brought up to cope with it. This is no longer the case. Increasingly, children are brought up to be super happy individualists who and what's important is not that they're conformist members of society, but that they're happy and that they're content and whatever. And so this means they can't cope with it either. And then finally, you simply have the fact that the correlation is quite clear. In low IQ genetically crosses over not only with mental instability and things like that, but just with being physically ill. We are genetically selecting for low IQ for people that have heart problems, for people that have strokes, and for people that have cancer. All these things cross over genetically with having low IQ because they are part of a general poor fitness factor. So these people are not only extremely mentally unstable and unable to cope in that way, they're also physically ill, and there is a psychological component to physical illness. So therefore these problems exacerbate their physical illness and just make life intolerable. So what we are dealing with, it has to be understood, is not a cost of living crisis. It is a cost of decadence crisis, and also then making that even worse is essentially a cost of dysgenics crisis. And that is why things are so bad. So, Merry Christmas. Hello, hello, hello! The Jolly Heretic is an online public house which meets on Mondays and Thursdays at 7 p.m. UK time, 2 p.m. New York, in which we discuss the kind of based, fearless science which is increasingly expunged from our woke, joke universities. If you would like to help the Jolly Heretic public house, and there are many ways you can do so, please, please, please become one of my patrons on Subscribestar. Also, if you want to, you can donate to the channel using Odyssey and Entropy, and you can also purchase Jolly Heretic merchandise, such as shirts and mugs. All of the links are in the description. Again, I'd be most violently grateful if you could assist the Jolly Heretic public house, and I will see you all soon, and goodbye!